Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anara Tabashalieva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guest. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Nara, and it is my honor to welcome back our current and frequent contributor, Dr. Robert McCollister from Ohio State University. Is his major in international relations and minor in comparative politics. Dr. McCollister specialized in national security policy and especially Soviet politics and U.S. foreign policy. His Ph.D. was titled Summit Diplomacy, at the time when summits were more popular than today. Dr. McCollister taught national security policy studies at Ohio State. While in graduate school, he has taught courses on U.S. military policy and U.S. foreign policy as an adjunct at Shawnee State and Morehead State University. Those are in Ohio and Kentucky. He also has been a public school teacher and a coach for most of the last 40 years. And above all, he currently serves on the board of two nonprofits, our partner organization Sunflower Seeds, Help for Ukraine in Tri-State Area, and also Green Energy Ohio. He will give us a digest of current events, which are a roller coaster, as everyone knows. We record this on the last Friday of August, and August 2025 will be an interesting month in history textbooks. I personally feel like I am back to 1938, which is not a pleasant feeling for a history professor. Dr. McCollister, the screen is yours. And before you start, I will remind people who are viewing that this week was 3.5 years of the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation into Ukraine, and we might even remind people where things are, because not everybody looks at the war map. So here is today's map and positions from Institute of Study of War, and Dr. McCollister might start commenting on what we see here, please.
Okay. We have the map up?
Yep.
Because I'm looking at a picture of myself here. I'll assume you guys are looking at the map.
Do you? Does everyone?
Yeah, I see a frozen picture of me, which is not necessarily good.
I can see that. I can see the map.
Okay, there we go. Okay. Yeah, Victor, when you said it's been 3.5 years, it struck me that 3.5 years is almost exactly the same amount of time that the United States was involved in the Second World War. From December 7th, 1941 to the end of the war in Europe in May 1945 and the end of the war in the Pacific. We just had the anniversary of that. It was a little more than 3.5 years for both. So this war has gone on for a long time. What you see is a map, and the area in light blue and pink together is the area that the Russians have taken first in their initial attack in 2014, and then in the full-scale invasion in February 2022. The light blue is the area that the Ukrainians were able to retake in the fall of 2023 in their counteroffensive. And the area in pink is the area which the Russians still hold. And since the failure of, I think I said the Ukrainian offensive in 2023, it was actually the fall of 2022. Since the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, What has essentially happened is the war has become pretty static. The Russians have been able to make some gains along those lines in the areas you see there circled in green. In Luhansk and Donetsk in particular. But they've done so at just enormous, enormous, enormous cost. The Russians have lost an incredible amount of equipment, have at times been losing 1,500 soldiers or more a week. But Putin has continued to throw those folks into the meat grinder. And we were actually talking about this right before we went on camera, is what seems to have developed is this strange combination of 21st century warfare and trench warfare from the First World War. You have trenches, very, very difficult to launch a successful offensive at any reasonable cost. So it reminds you a lot of Verdun and the Somme and the battles, the horrific battles of 1915, 1916, 1917. We are entering a period where it seems to be a period of defensive dominance, where it's very difficult to launch an attack because the battlefields have become a lot more transparent. World War II was a war of mobility because the speed with which you could strike, you could mass your armor and attack an enemy at the weak point, as the Germans did in the Ardennes in May 1940. And you could gain ground. You could overcome an opponent's defenses. But now you have a battlefield that's far more transparent. And with a combination of a transparent battlefield with drone technology, the small first-person drones, loitering drones, all the things that have been developing over the last few decades, it's very difficult to amass an attack and have the enemy not know about it. When you combine that with precision-guided weapons, whether it's the small armed first-person drones, larger drones like we have the Predator and the Reaper, with drones and precision-guided weapons of other kinds, cruise missiles, longer-range weapons, defense is now seem to be entering a period of defensive dominance, which means it's really hard to gain ground. In that situation, when you have a period of defensive dominance, what tends to happen is that the war drags on, becomes a war of attrition until one side or the other, one of two things happens. Either you come to a ceasefire or a peace agreement, or one side or the other collapses. That's what happened in 1918. The German side collapsed after their offensive in March 1918 that showed some sign of succeeding. They got within, gosh, I'd have to go back and look, 20, 30 miles of Paris. Then that offensive ground to a halt. The British and the French counterattacked. We get involved in the war very, very late. Our first big offensive was in the end of September 1918, but the German forces collapsed beginning in about July and August. That doesn't mean that's what's going to happen in Ukraine, but that's the way wars like that typically end. And the other way is through diplomacy, which is a nice segue into what's been happening. As Victor said, I guess fortuitously for where we are right now, my Ph.D. dissertation at Ohio State was on U.S.-Soviet summit meetings during the Cold War. And we've seen the importance of summits in the last month. First beginning with the Anchorage summit between Vladimir Putin and President Trump. The Anchorage summit was the most hastily arranged summit in this post-Cold War era. And if you go back and look at the Cold War era, it's the most hastily arranged summit since really Reykjavik, October 10th and 11th, 1986. That was an extraordinary summit to write about. It's a chapter in my dissertation. There were just huge things put on the table, but it was very hastily arranged. And at summit, what actually happened was Gorbachev came very well prepared The American side was not prepared. They thought it was going to be some quick negotiations about the next meeting, a full summit. Actually called it a base camp to a full summit. But Gorbachev came loaded with gigantic, historic arms control proposals. In the end, it did not happen. Those weren't adopted, agreed to, but it was a really interesting meeting. This is the only other one I can think of in the Cold War that kind of was similar was the Vienna summit in 1961, which had more difficult results. So as you go into this summit, both sides clearly had goals. President Trump, as he traveled to the summit in the days before and then on the plane as he traveled to the summit, really laid out two objectives, two things he thought would come out of the meeting. One was he was absolutely determined to get a ceasefire in place. Goal number one, and he said over and over again, he would not be happy if he didn't get a ceasefire. The second thing he talked about, and this made the Ukrainians very nervous, were land swaps. Because if you're talking about land swaps, especially since the Ukrainians have been driven out of that Kursk salient that they took from Russia earlier this year, the only land to be swapped was Ukrainian land. So that made the Ukrainians pretty nervous about what they were going to be asked to give up and what they might get in return. Putin came in with, I think, pretty clear objectives. And to be honest, at the end of the summit in Anchorage, it was pretty clearly a victory for Vladimir Putin. Putin got pretty much what he wanted. The first thing he wanted more than anything else was at least a partial lifting of his pariah status. Vladimir Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for kidnapping, overseeing the kidnapping of 20,000 Ukrainian children and settling them in Russia. He has been indicted. There are a lot of countries in the world he can't go to without being arrested. The United States is not one of them because we're not a member of the International Criminal Court. But he wanted the beginning of the lifting of that pariah status. He got that. His reception by President Trump was enthusiastic, I guess is one way to say it. And he got the famous greeting on the red carpet and the ride in the beast, and that helped accomplish that goal. The second thing he got was that President Trump climbed down from that insistence that he wanted an immediate ceasefire. At the end of the summit, he had completely reversed his position and had adopted the Russian position that a ceasefire was not a reliable short-term goal, that what you needed to was move straight to a comprehensive negotiation and a comprehensive settlement. That's been the Russian position all along. He also wanted to see if he could stop American aid to Ukraine, lift the possibility of secondary sanctions, of more economic sanctions on the Russians. He largely got that, although the United States has now imposed another 25% tariff on India, specifically, raising tariffs on India to 50%, ostensibly for the purchase, because they're purchasing Russian oil. Interestingly, China buys a lot more Russian oil. They did not get the same treatment. They did not get a 25% increase in tariffs. And I think another thing that Putin wanted was he wanted to restore his connection, his relationship with President Trump. And I think he accomplished that as well. Famously, President Trump, a few days after the summit, had received a picture of themselves together on the red carpet, and he showed it in an Oval Office press conference. And I think Putin feels as though he had accomplished that goal as well. In fact, on an open mic, President Trump, when he was meeting with the European leaders a few days later, said he believed sincerely that Putin wanted to get to an agreement for him. So I think Putin got that as well. The next round of summits came just a couple days later on Monday when Vladimir Zelenskyy came to the White House for a second trip. It was very interesting that as soon as that was announced and formalized, all of the other important leaders in Europe came as well. Chancellor Merz, President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, Prime Minister Maloney, the leaders of the EU, everybody came because I think they were very keen to avoid what had happened during Zelensky's first trip to the Oval Office. They wanted to prevent that kind of confrontation. They wanted to support Zelenskyy and make sure that he did not come under pressure to make particular concessions on land swaps, that the allies stayed on the same page, that the United States and the Europeans presented a united front in confronting Russia, in supporting Ukraine. I also think they wanted to lay down a marker. I think the Europeans believe they deserve, if not a place at the table, because Ukraine vitally impacts their security as well. They want a place at the table. And if they can't be in the direct negotiations, they want to make sure that they are extensively consulted. So I thought that was actually really smart diplomacy by our European allies to come and make sure, sorry, something fell back there, to make sure that the Western alliance stayed on the same page. So coming out of these two rounds of summitry, President Trump begins to talk about what the next steps are. What's the next phase? What are the next phases? And he talks about direct talks between Zelenskyy and Putin, followed by a trilateral summit in which he would take part, where he would, I think his goal was to mediate between the two sides and help get them to an agreement. The one thing that in between the Washington meetings and the Trump-Putin summit that seemed hopeful was that the president's negotiator on the Sunday shows in between those two summits, Steve Witkoff, implied that the Russians had agreed in the discussions in Anchorage to something like Article 5 commitments, meaning the NATO alliance, or at least, if not a formal NATO commitment to defend, at least European members of NATO, and maybe even the United States, committing to security arrangements for Ukraine, because security arrangements are the entire game. That's the most important thing that needs to come out of any peace negotiation. Besides territory, Ukraine needs real security agreements, and the negotiator, Steve Witkoff, implied on the Sunday shows that President Trump had gotten those assurances that would be allowed by President Putin. That pretty much got discarded pretty quickly. President Trump hinted at a possible U.S. role, and he's talked some about that since then. But he has ruled out U.S. troops, and he has ruled out NATO membership for Ukraine. Well, that's a problem because that takes away the West's most powerful cards before the negotiation begins. And we've talked a lot about cards and who has cards and who doesn't recently. That we gave away our two most powerful cards: the possibility of American direct involvement in security arrangements for Ukraine, even American troops, American air power, whatever form it might take, and NATO membership. Those are two cards, A, that Ukraine wants, and B, that Putin really wants to avoid. So those would be powerful tools in a negotiation, but those have been given away. If the next round of negotiations happens, I am skeptical that it will. There may be low-level talks rather than a direct summit meeting. I think a direct summit meeting between Putin and Zelenskyy right now would be at best a waste of time and be potentially very dangerous. You might get some low-level talks. If the Russians follow what they did in 2022, they would send a very low-level negotiation. But if there are talks, even though they look more unlikely now, what are the goals of the next round of negotiations? There have been talks, hints that they might happen in Budapest. If I was Vladimir Zelenskyy, I wouldn't want that. Budapest would be pretty much a home game for Vladimir Putin, given Viktor Orban's close relationship with Putin, despite Hungary's membership in NATO. So what would Zelenskyy want out of negotiation? First of all, he would like a ceasefire in place. If there's going to be a ceasefire, he doesn't want to agree to land swaps. He wants a ceasefire in place. Vladimir Zelenskyy cannot formally give up territory in a negotiation. That's in the Ukrainian constitution. He can't do that. Even if he could constitutionally, he would be dead politically if he did. The Ukrainian people are never going to agree to formally cede even Crimea, let alone the other provinces that the Russians are claiming. He might be able to acknowledge a fact that the Russians control parts of almost all of Luhansk, most of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, parts of those. He might be able to acknowledge their physical control, but then you might get something like the West Germans did in the Paris negotiations in 1954-55 when they entered NATO, or similar to the Shanghai Communique in 1972, when the United States and China agreed that there was one China, Taiwan was part of China, but they would never be reunified by force. What he might be able to say is, look, we understand the Russians have it. We believe it is ours, but that reunification someday when it happens will happen peacefully. He might be able to pull that off, but he can only pull that off if he gets real security guarantees, actual, physical, tangible security guarantees, NATO membership, troop deployments, significant military aid. NATO membership's been taken off the table. There has been talk about a European force. The number I've seen quite a bit is 15,000. Not exactly sure what their composition will be. Will they be logistical troops? Would they be combat forces? 15,000 would be about a division's worth. But they would obviously, it's European troops, so they'd come from a number of different countries. It's not clear who they would be, what their role would be. That's a tripwire force. Lawrence Friedman actually wrote an article about this, about different levels of commitment to keep the peace. And he talked about the Korean example, and you can deploy a force that could stop an invasion in its tracks, or that could slow down an invasion, or stop it for a time and allow reinforcements to come, or a tripwire force. So stopping an invasion in its tracks would be the highest level, a significant force that would allow time for a follow-on force to defeat an invader, in this case, obviously the Russians. A tripwire force would be you put enough people in place that the Russians have to think that they could well have to fight all, at least, of the European members of NATO, that it would trip deployments of more troops. That's being considered. Not sure exactly what the force makeup, what that will look like. Putin's goals in any negotiation, that's pretty simple. He wants all of Ukraine. I don't think he's given up on that. And if he doesn't want all of it, he wants all of it he can get. I mean, we know, and you saw the map earlier, he claims all of 4 provinces. Crimea is, in Vladimir Putin's mind, is Russian. He still claims Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, moving from west to east. I think his real goal, at least short-term goal, and if there was to be a ceasefire, and this is where I think the land swap thing came in, is he wants all of Donetsk. Well, he doesn't have all of Donetsk. The northwestern corner of Donetsk is still in Ukrainian hands. And it's very significant why he wants that. And, you know, you've got to be really careful about World War II analogies. And Victor talked about 1938, and believe me, my mind's gone there a lot. In the Munich conference, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland. Now, why did Hitler say, and this is going to sound familiar if you've listened to Putin's propaganda, why did Hitler say he wanted the Sudetenland? He said the Sudetenland was full of Germans, that 95% of the people that lived in the Sudeten area of Czechoslovakia were Germans, and that they were a mistreated minority. That sounds pretty familiar for people who followed Putin's rhetoric. In reality, that area was mountainous. The Czechs had spent a couple $2 billion fortifying those mountain passes, and it would have made any invasion of Czechoslovakia very difficult. What he demanded and what he got at Munich was Neville Chamberlain agreed to give it to him. The rest of Czechoslovakia is much less defensible, and they had just given away Czechoslovakia's defenses. That's very close to what Vladimir Putin wants. The area that Putin doesn't control, Donetsk, is where those defensive lines have been built. Layered, again, we're back to 1916, layered trench systems, multi layers of defenses that the Russians would have to try to break through, and the terrain is difficult. If he gets all of Donetsk, the rest of the terrain headed toward the Dnipro River is much different and much less defensible. Much less defensible. And hang on just a second. Guys. Sorry, family walked in. The rest of that territory is far more difficult to defend. That's what he wants. And the other thing he wants is, Steve Witkoff talked about Article 5 like guarantees. If you listen to Sergei Lavrov and what he said since then, he wants something a lot more like the Budapest Agreement of 1994. And Russia has to be involved in these security guarantees. Well, that's letting the fox in the hen house. He only wants vague guarantees, promises of support. And, you know, here we go back with the Munich analogy, kind of like Hitler's promise that he wouldn't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia, which he did 6 months later in March 1939. What I think is real is that Putin wants the war to continue. I don't think he has any sense right now. He thinks he's in the driver's seat. He wants to head off sanctions. He doesn't want to trigger secondary sanctions, especially on China. He doesn't want to trigger any kind of economic sanctions that might be put on Russia. He definitely doesn't want the Europeans to confiscate the 300 billion or so in Russian assets in their banks. He wants to head off American arms sales to the Europeans, who then transfer those weapons to Ukraine. The ultimate goal, and what he and Zelenskyy are both going to try to do, through the next round of talks, through the next round of on the battlefield, is he has to make Zelenskyy look like the villain. He needs in Trump's eyes, because he knows that Trump wants to end the war. Trump desperately wants that Nobel Peace Prize. He knows that he has to make Zelenskyy the villain. If he makes Zelenskyy the villain, if he makes it look like Zelenskyy is the one in the blocking peace, then he can keep Trump from aiding the Ukrainians, placing sanctions on Russia, and the war can continue. And the other thing is, I think if he can get Zelenskyy to seem the villain and the United States turns its back on the conflict, he can start to drive a wedge between America, between President Trump and our NATO allies, which is his ultimate goal, is to weaken NATO as much as possible. Zelenskyy needs Putin to be the villain. Zelenskyy needs to demonstrate that he wants peace, because if he can prove that it's Putin that's pushing war, he has a better chance of getting American aid, or at least American arms sales to the Europeans, which are then transferred to the Ukrainians. He has a better chance of getting better security guarantees. But the bottom line is, and I'll finish with this, Putin is playing a long game. Putin thinks time is on his side, and I don't just mean on the battlefield. All across Europe, he is strengthening nationalist forces across Europe. He already has an ally inside the NATO penthouse in Hungary. He has an ally inside NATO in Hungary and Slovakia, pretty much. He has friends inside NATO. If you look at public opinion polling, AfD, the Alternative for Germany party, which has Russian support, is polling ahead of the Christian Democrats. He has supported the National Rally in France. And if you can weaken French and German support for Ukraine, both of those parties, were they to come to power, both of those parties are absolutely pro-Putin, anti-helping Ukraine. They have intervened in Romania's election. He has intervened in elections all over. I have never thought of Putin as a particularly far-sighted strategic thinker. I've always thought of him as a great tactician, but I think he has stumbled on something really important. And that's the center of gravity of Western power. That term from Clausewitz, the great source of Western power, is public opinion and public support. In a democracy, that's everything. And he has stumbled on something, and we've got a lot of folks who have backgrounds in the Soviet Union and remember the Cold War, that throughout the Cold War, the Russians always tried to influence, always tried to influence Western public opinion. When, Dr. King and the protesters marched on Washington, when they held a protest in Birmingham, they always tried to take advantage of that. Always tried to talk about repression of Black folks in the United States. And they tried to play in American politics, but their tools were so weak. Social media has changed all that. Social media has changed the way people get information and has given them a tool to reach directly into Western publics and influence them. I don't have any real answers for that. Thought a lot about what we do about that, but he is, through social media campaigns, he has intervened in the Brexit vote. He has intervened in support of the Alternative for Germany party, for the League in Italy, for the National Rally in France. The Russian banks loaned money to Marine Le Pen. Intervened massively in the Romanian election last December. The bottom line is this: Putin will stop when he's forced to stop. The West has to find a way to get the kind of long-range weapons, that can take the war directly to the Russians, and Ukraine is making progress on this. But with Western help, with Taurus missiles or American JASSM missiles or whatever, to take the war directly to Russia, to attack, in many ways, the center of gravity of Russia is their oil economy, because their entire economy is based on oil. It's a huge part of the national budget. Attack their oil industry, attack their power grid, take the war directly to the Russians, to the Russian war machine. That's the only way you can force Putin to stop, because that might start to turn the public that Putin cares about the most, the Russian elites, against the war. And if with that, I can take your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCollister. This was fascinating presentation, and we already have a question from Dr. Deutsch. Please, Leonard.
Hi. You've been talking about land swaps. How much Russian territory does Ukraine still control?
Very, very little. It's the area, the Kursk area in Russia. They have largely been pushed out. I haven't checked it lately. It's if there's any, it's a tiny amount.
That's what I was afraid you were going to say.
Yeah, the North Koreans played a role in that. They threw a lot of North Korean troops in there. Putin saw the advantage. He saw negotiations potentially coming. He saw that gave Ukraine a bit of leverage. So he put a pretty maximum effort in pushing the Ukrainians out.
Thanks.
Yep.
More questions and comments, please. Another, please.
I am very thankful for your great analysis. It's a comprehensive. It included many things that hidden, and you're actually a great expert. You deciphered this.
Thank you.
Usually in the West, some moments overlooked. And I have a question. Can you discuss possible scenario for development of the war in event of Putin's death? And he already old. He has several actually doubles, as well known. And also Putin's another question is: do you see any possibilities or possible approach that overlooked by current analysts? They analyze different scenarios, but something is not visible, but it may appear anytime and may change situation. So what do you think about this? Thank you.
The great weakness of the Russian system, if you go all the way back to Lenin, is transition of power. That they have no mechanism for the peaceful transfer of power. And you look at the power struggle after Lenin's death, it took 4 years for Stalin to consolidate his power. After Stalin's death, it took about 4 years for Khrushchev to consolidate its power. It's always been a problem. I don't expect, if you look at the people who currently run Russia, who are in charge, he has surrounded himself with largely former intelligence officials, people that he knows and trusts well. And that's where you would look for potential successors. If that's what happens, if something were to happen to Putin, if he were to die, or if somehow there was a palace coup, and I think that's probably the most likely, is that somebody within that circle would take power. And I don't know that you necessarily would get anything any better. That's the kind of cynical, practical way. the thing about predicting these things, and the CIA, I don't know that they've ever, as much as extraordinary as their capabilities are, I don't know they've ever accurately predicted anything like this in the Soviet Union in 1990-91 and Iran in 1979, and they were always caught up short. So yeah, it's like Yogi Berra said, predictions are really hard, especially about the future. That's, I think, the most likely scenario, that it's another one of those people. We got Gorbachev because he was brought up through the ranks by Andropov. And I think Andropov, because as he was former head of KGB, understood that the Soviet system was in need of reform, that he, more than anybody else, knew where that the system was crumbling. So he promoted this reformer. But even when Gorbachev took over, and I don't think anybody expected Gorbachev to go as far as he did. So that's most likely. Could there be a popular uprising, a color revolution, like the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia? I don't know. I mean, it's always possible. Putin has done a pretty good job of eliminating the people who could lead those revolutions, unfortunately. In terms of how could we be surprised? We could be surprised by the Ukrainians' ability to use deep strike weapons to maybe destabilize the Russian hierarchy. I think that's a possibility. Some of the new weapons that they've debuted in the last few days are actually pretty impressive and really reminiscent of, I wrote a paper about cruise missiles when I was in graduate school a long time ago, reminiscent of some of the cruise missiles that the United States developed, the Regulus and some others. And they carry a very big payload. And Russian air defenses are really not very good. I think that's a possible good surprise. On the Ukrainian side, on the downside, some kind of collapse, sudden collapse at a critical sector of the front that would allow the Russians to begin to advance more quickly. I don't see that happening, but often that can happen. If you go back and look at 1918, nobody predicted the German offensive in March 1918 would succeed like it did, and then would collapse as fast as it did and lead to revolution in Germany. That could be a model maybe for something to happen in Russia, but that's all speculation.
Great. I really appreciate your answer. And related to Andropov, you mentioned, that's a very interesting paradox. Both Gorbachev and Putin adored Andropov. Andropov promoted Gorbachev, and also he worked with Putin. And even today, Putin in his office has a big picture of Andropov. How you can explain? Yeah, that's actually well known that Andropov, he's a guru for Putin, and that's how you explain that. If we would like to unite and compare Gorbachev and Putin, we only can see that both actually venerated, and one is venerated and another venerates Andropov.
Wow, I didn't know that.
You didn't know? That's actually,
I didn't know that.
Andropov and Putin, you see that Putin actually follows all principles and doctrine of Andropov.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd come back if Andropov hadn't died when he did, you could dig him up, bring him back. I'm not sure he would have approved of what Gorbachev did. Gorbachev's a really unique figure in history, really interesting guy to study. Putin, I think, is more in the Russian political tradition.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much. More comments and questions, please. While you're thinking, I will insert my own question. There have been considerable chatter recently among experts about another possible front, the Baltics. If one looks at the map, to remind our viewers, there is a small piece of land called Suwalki Corridor on the border of Lithuania and Poland, which separates Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, former Königsberg, from Belarus, Russian client, about 30 miles only or less, which would be one possible target. Again, people are not sure if this will be a goal or it is just a disinformation goal. What do you think about this part of the world?
Honestly, I have thought for a long time Putin wanted to reconnect Kaliningrad with Russia. I mean, he's essentially annexed Belarus now. Belarus has pretty much been annexed in everything but name. It's still difficult for him to do it while he's bogged down in Ukraine. If the war in Ukraine were to end more favorably for him, I think that's next. I think that's next on his list. If he in particular can weaken NATO, and you start to see America's commitment to NATO questioned more and more, I think that makes that gamble a lot less dangerous. If he can get some elections to go his way in Western Europe, in Germany in particular, I think that's a real possibility too. If he can get a more divided Western alliance, an America that seems more remote from the defense of Europe, then the gamble to try to do that is not nearly as big a gamble. And it probably wouldn't start with a direct invasion. It might be something a lot more like what he did in 2014 with the little green men in Crimea and in Donetsk and Luhansk. I think it might be something along like that. He might precipitate an incident, and here we go back to 1938, where he has to go in and defend Russian speakers in Lithuania. So it might begin something like that. Test the waters. What's the Western response? If the Western response is weak, then he can move further. I mean, Putin's pretty good at boiling the frog, at making a move, I'm going to use a lot of analogies here, making the move, sticking a toe in the water, see what the response is. And then if the world doesn't respond, move a little bit further. What was it that Winston Churchill said in the late 1940s? That the Soviet Union is like a burglar that would check every door to see it was locked until they found one that was unlocked. And I have thought all along that that is a possibility. That's why stopping him where he is right now is so important. And if you are going to learn the lessons of the late 1930s, is that you stop these things early. You stop them before they gather strength. When Hitler took Czechoslovakia, all of his generals were telling him Germany was too weak for a war in 1938. All of them. That his brinksmanship over the Sudetenland was dangerous, and were cautioning him not to start a war in Europe in 1938. Hitler understood something they didn't, was the weakness of the governments in Europe and how much they had been devastated by World War I and were unwilling to stand up to him. He understood that far better than they did. I don't think Hitler was any strategic genius either, but he did understand the weakness of Western leaders and how willing they were to pay any price for peace. Well, if you'll pay any price for peace, then somebody's going to make you pay a price. But when he took Czechoslovakia, the Czechs actually had a pretty impressive war industry. And when the Germans invade Poland a year later, or later in 1939, there are a lot of Czech tanks that are part of that. The same could be said of Ukraine. I forget how many brigades Ukraine has in the field now. Well, Ukraine's not going to be ready to fight for Russia anytime soon, but that's an awful lot of additional power that Russia would have. You have to stop these things before they gather momentum. That's what everybody coming. Why did we all grow up in the longest period of great power peace? Because the people who went through World War II learned those lessons, and they learned them well, and they built a better world, which is now being unraveled.
Thank you. And since I see no more questions or comments at this point, I will ask, oh, Leslie has one. Leslie, please.
Yes, I have basically two things to say. The first one is rather jokey, but I'm kind of surprised that Putin didn't give Trump another of his balls. This is in reference to their last meeting. Putin gave Trump a soccer ball that had been used to score a winning goal in some football match, supposedly for Trump to give to his son Barron.
Hey, I can think of a lot of jokes there, but I won't.
Yeah. I tried to keep it as clean as possible.
Okay.
But the other thing is that I've been reading the Foundation series by Asimov and also watching the TV show based on it.
Yes.
And I've done a little bit of thinking over the past hour of how you would frame this in a psychohistorical perspective. So basically, what I was thinking is that a lot of the basically stagnation in the war can kind of be explained in pseudo-mathematical terms by various factors canceling out. So, for instance, the social pressures in Russia are pushing them to support Putin in the war. The social pressures in Ukraine are pushing them to not give up in the war. So the morale on either side probably isn't going to break entirely. There's been some disruption in Ukraine when Zelenskyy tried to push a particular reform of the watchdog agencies or whatever that the people didn't like, but then he backtracked on that. So he's clearly flexible enough to know when he's made a political mistake. So neither side is probably going to politically collapse very soon. Technologically, both sides seem more or less equal. If one side gets a new technological development, the other side tends to get it. So we can sort of factor that out, and the advantage may even be on the Ukrainian side since they have Western backing. So if we factor both of those out, then what we're left with is basically economics and external pressures, which are also tied in together in terms of sanctions. So in some ways, I think one of the only things that could really make the current war of attrition and stagnation change would be a change in the external pressures. And again, I think that the external pressures are kind of balanced currently because Trump is very unsteady about supporting Ukraine, whereas the Europeans are generally very strong about supporting Ukraine. So if those two forces are working against each other, then you have more stagnation.
You know, talk about foundation. It's been a long, psychohistory. It's been a long time since I've done linear regression analysis. That's I would have to go back to graduate school to get on that. But I think I think there's a lot to what you're saying. Where I think Putin thinks he has the advantage, and where things don't balance out, is that he thinks, because of the superiority of his system, he can outlast the West. That Western democracies are weak, that the United States is returning to its old isolationist ways, and that the European commitment to defend Ukraine is not as strong as it needs to be. That eventually European support for Ukraine will crumble, and without American support and without European support, he can outlast us, and Ukraine can't stand up to Russia alone. I think that when I said he's playing a long game, I think that's his calculation. I don't necessarily think he's right, but I think that's his calculation. And to go back to Anara's point, dictatorships are strong until they aren't. You never know when there's a tipping point and they collapse. That would be a nice surprise. but you can't plan for it. Hope is not a strategy.
Thank you. Larry, please.
Thanks.
Dr. McCollister, hi. It's good to
Hey.
have you back.
Thanks, Larry.
On Wednesday night, or on Wednesday, 50% tariffs went into effect on India because they continue to buy Russian oil. This really throws a monkey wrench into Trump's tariff strategy to realign global supply chains. The fact that he did it pretty much shows he's committed to Ukraine. It seems to me.
I hope that's true. It is strategically, and Fareed Zakaria has been talking about this a lot, an interesting choice. It does absolutely, if you were trying to pressure China and force the Chinese to change their export strategy to realign global supply chains, as you said. India is vital to that. The Quad that's been building as this cooperative network, you don't want to say alliance, but this cooperative network, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, to, in some sense, contain the growth of Chinese power, has been a pretty important American emphasis for a while now, building that relationship. If that is a signal of his intent to support Ukraine, I'm not completely convinced it is, but it is interesting. If it turns out, and this is all unfolding, we don't know where it's going to go. If that's a signal of his commitment to defend Ukraine, then what we should see is a renewed American commitment to ship weapons to Ukraine, because that's the most important thing. I think economic pressure on the Russians will take a while. It might ultimately pay off. Oil's a tough thing, though, because the world needs oil, and oil is fungible. And if it's not sold here, it's somebody else buys it. We've had difficulty trying to impose caps on prices of oil and that kind of stuff. But if it shows his commitment to put economic pressure, but especially the key is military pressure, to sell them the kind of weapons they need to take directly to the Russians, then that is a tremendous breakthrough for Ukraine. So I hope that's exactly what's happening.
I think double too with, I forget how to pronounce his name, but Rutte, the head of NATO, said that NATO and the US agreed that they would split global defense so that US would take care of China, the rest of NATO would take care of Europe. And that NATO had agreed to purchase weaponry from the US, and Trump had agreed to sell that weaponry for defense of NATO. Trump simply didn't want the US to continue paying for it. And Europe agreed that they would do that. So a lot of the new funding for NATO that the European countries have to get through their parliaments to see if they're actually going to do this, to take it up to 5%, will be used to supply weaponry to Ukraine. So I think there are different pieces being put into place, along with the fact that a lot of Trump's supporters, being America First people, are also isolationists. So Trump has to be very careful in a way to move slowly so that he can say, see, I really tried to work with Putin. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I made him almost like a hero for wanting peace, and he's turned it down. He continues to attack civilians. He continues to attack apartment buildings and hospitals. We really have no other choice. So by the time he really moves wholeheartedly in the support for Ukraine, he has an alibi that he can, and I think his supporters will not abandon him, because they'll say, yeah, he really did try. And Putin wouldn't play ball. Just that also seems to play into this. narrative, at least, that, as Trump said during the campaign, that the U.S. would never abandon Ukraine, that is his long-term strategy. Of course, time will tell.
I hope. That's exactly right. That the United States and the European alliance remain strong. I would like to see American ground troops continue to be deployed in Europe, so that the Russians know that if they have larger ambitions toward Kaliningrad or whatever, they would have to fight the United States on day one. Those American ground troops and all the military supplies that are pre-positioned there are not going to be of much help in a war with China anyway.
Right.
A war with China is a naval war. And the most important thing, if you're talking about the defense of Taiwan, which is what you're talking about, if you're talking about the defense of Taiwan, the most important thing is to strengthen the alliances in the region, to strengthen our alliance with South Korea and Japan, with Taiwan and the Philippines. Because if you look at geography, the Chinese ability to project power anywhere in the world is very much constrained by what they call the first island chain.
Right.
And the American bases in the region. So those alliances have to remain incredibly strong, because if they don't, you also get the danger of nuclear proliferation. But if that's the way that unfolds, awesome. And I hope that's what happens. I hope this is a period of readjustment and not retrenchment.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a nice close up or closure, and I think we will leave all the questions speculating on nuclear options for another hour, because nobody knows what this kind of worm looks like. Just to conclude, one more attention for our viewers on another NATO country, Turkey, which is a very close ally of Azerbaijan, and there is very serious brewing conflict between Azerbaijan, formerly loyal to Russian Federation, and Putin. Unexpected and very interesting outcome of essentially the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, and definitely a new development in this part of the world that has not seen this type of summits and agreements, I would say never. This Transcaucasian area is as potent as Middle East. In fact, it is an extension of Middle East. This will conclude our 183rd meeting of MUkraine discussion group at Marshall University, West Virginia, and we again are very grateful to our friend, neighbor, and local activist, Dr. Robert McCollister, for being with us today in this last week of August. And let's hope that September will bring us not only an expected beginning of new semester, but unexpected and positive developments. Our hearts are with our friends in Ukraine. Slava Ukraine. Thank you.